Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Come on inside. Come inside. Keep making room. Come on. There's still more room. Keep moving over. Move over. Make room for the people coming in. Come on. Keep squeezing in. Come on. All right. We're there. We're there. Welcome to episode 90 of the Clock Dodgers podcast. I am your host, Neal. I have a guest with me today, a returning guest, none other than Ian McLaughlin. You know him if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast. He is a PhD student in neuroscience. I first ran into Ian on Periscope, which is the video streaming app where you can kind of conversate with people through the app itself. And so he's on there a lot, and he's communicating with people through there and connecting with people. He actually even lets you call in. We talk about it a little bit on the episode, but he's a PhD student in neuroscience, really smart dude. And so the conversations are always really enriching. You know, there's a lot that we learn in these conversations with Ian, a lot of interest and stuff discussed. I like bringing Ian on, and people like Ian because, as you guys know, mental health is a big thing in our lives today, and addiction and these kind of things that maybe we don't fully understand yet, or maybe we do have a good idea of some of these things, but he always kind of sheds light on those things. He makes it interesting. He makes it fun as it can be in certain topics. But we get to go deep with Ian all the time and go really deep into good topics and conversations. So I always enjoy Ian coming on. For you guys who like to look at the guests before you listen to the episode, if you're not familiar with him, you can find him at _anthropoid. That's ANTHROPOID. Whew, some letters there. That's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. Definitely check him out there, though. Also, I highly recommend his podcast, which is Wired to Be Weird. You guys know I only bring on guests that I really feel like are good conversations for you guys, have good information for you guys, and I would never recommend their, obviously, I wouldn't recommend their podcast or anything if I didn't believe in it, if I didn't enjoy it. And his podcast is fantastic. So Wired to Be Weird is the podcast you want to subscribe to, and you can find that on all the different podcasts and platforms that you can find Clock Dodgers on. So go check that out for sure. I always appreciate you guys supporting those guests that come on the show because I'm a big fan of those people. I'm good friends with those people, and I want you guys to be as well because we're all family, right? So go do that, please. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to mention No Halftime, which is a daily fantasy sports app where you get to play player versus player matchups, and you can win yourself a lot of money. Or at the very least, have yourself a lot of fun. You can use the promo code CLOCK, CLOCK, when you sign up. When you make your first deposit, you'll get a 50% bonus up to $50. You can't lose. You can't lose. Well, you can lose. I can't say you can't lose. You can't lose using the promo code, but you certainly can lose on the app. So what I advise you to do is brush up before you start playing on there. Listen to more episodes of the Cloud Dodgers podcast. Follow us on social media. We give tons of tips and stuff for No Halftime. So No Halftime, the sponsor of the Cloud Dodgers podcast, one of our favorites, right? We love No Halftime. So I highly suggest you guys check it out, download it, use the promo code, tell your friends and family about it. It's a lot of fun. And it doesn't have to be just football. I say football a lot because it's what we're in right now, and it's what I really enjoy. But basketball's on there now. Basketball season just kicked off. Baseball, when it comes back around, all different sports. So check them out. And one other thing that I don't want to fail to mention before we get into the conversation, for you guys who are listening, if you've been listening since last year, you remember we did this Toys for Tots charity fundraiser type thing. Well, we're doing it again this year. So I've joined up with guys from Break from the Grind podcast and Fantasy Football Breakdown this year. Guys I've been talking to, we've connected through the Fantasy Life app. So if you guys are familiar with that, what I basically want you guys to do here is we did this last year. We're going to do it even more bigger this year as far as I want to get more stuff seen to you guys as far as the process. So as far as Periscope is concerned, Instagram, things like that, I want you guys more involved in it. So if you could just donate, anything helps. Literally $5, $1, whatever you can give. What I'm going to ask you guys to do is just go visit the website, which I'm going to have it up on my Twitter and my Instagram. So go to either one of those, follow me on those things, and you'll see the link there. And when you click the link, you just go straight to it. It's on ukaren.com. And like I said, you go to the social media. Through my social media, you'll find the direct link, so you won't have to do no searching or nothing. But we're just trying to raise a lot of money. and it goes to Toys for Tots 100%. We don't take anything or nothing like that. And it's really good. Last year was a lot of fun. It's so powerful when you do these kind of things, because when we were like shopping, there was people coming up to us giving us money, or, getting excited about what we're doing. So I really would love it if you guys can get involved. It means a lot. If you guys, when you donate, I believe you can mention like your name and leave a little comment or note if you want. If you do that, what I'll be doing is I'll be picking random people who leave, let's say leave hashtag Clock Dodgers. And if you do that, I'll be picking random people from that list to win prizes. I'm not going to say what they are. I'm not going to go on the record and say what prize they are, but I'll have things to give away. So if you put hashtag Clock Dodgers, when you donate, you'll get automatically put into a raffle. But there's raffles that we're doing also, just so you guys know, for like Le'Veon Bell signed helmet, and we'll have more things too. So it's just a lot of fun. It's for a great cause. I love it. If you guys can do it, I really appreciate it. I don't want to hold you up from the conversation anymore. We'll talk about this again more on the other side of the conversation. Again, the guest today is Ian McLaughlin. Check him out. It's a great conversation. I'll see you guys on the other end. Let's go.
Cannot play with him. Cannot win with him. Cannot coach with him. Can't do it.
You play to win the game.
I mean, listen, we talking about practice. Not a game, not a game, not a game. We talking about practice.
Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier. Touchdown!
You are now locked in to the Clock Dodgers podcast.
Clock Dodgers Podcast.
Welcome back to the Clock Dodgers podcast. Ian, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I appreciate you joining me. I always enjoy when you come on, because we have this chance to talk, and I come away with a bunch of information where I can use in other conversations and sound smarter than I am. So it's always helpful.
Good. Mission accomplished.
Yeah. How's Pennsylvania, man? Everything good over there?
Yeah, everything's great. It's turned into winter, which is my favorite season, so can't complain.
That's good. So I just seen one of your Periscopes. You just got back from Washington. Were you there for like pleasure, or was it science related?
Oh yeah. So it was sort of science adjacent. So it was the first time that a bunch of candidates for federal office who are scientists have ever gathered, and they have like a bunch of strategic support, as well as like campaign support in general. And so it was basically just a chance to get to like interact with a bunch of scientists who've just decided that they want to, represent a bigger role of science in the federal government.
Nice. So it's important. So it was a little fun kind of probably, but it was in the name of science. So it's
Yeah, I mean it was pretty chaotic. I mean there was something like 80 people in like one house.
Oh wow.
In like, it was kind of a small house, and it was really cool, very interesting. But pretty chaotic.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, I mean, anyone who, who's listened to our talks on here, they know that we'll jump around kind of from topics to different unique situations. And the one thing I kind of wanted to start with you, when I talked to you, on Twitter, I had mentioned to you that, the Aaron Hernandez situation, which,
Right.
He's a guy that most people know for his, for what he had, his skills on the football field. But the reason I wanted to discuss him with you was nothing to do with football. It was more so that, what he allegedly did off of it and kind of his end of his life. And like I said, I don't want to get too much into, the situations themselves, and I don't want to talk about all that kind of stuff, but more so the report that came out last month, I think it was, from Boston University about his brain. Did you see any of that at all?
Yeah. So when it came out, it would come up when I would live stream. And so I just decided I needed to familiarize myself a little bit more with his history. And it sort of became clear. I wasn't as familiar with these sort of incidents, but, in 2007, 2013, basically in the years leading up to his to this finding, he had a history of a bunch of sort of violent altercations and impulse control problems. And then when it came out that he had basically stage 3 of CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it sort of became clear that there must have been a relationship between that kind of brain trauma and the things that he had the incidents that he had been associated with.
Right. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you, because obviously, we're not looking for an excuse for this guy and what he's done or anything, but, CTE is fairly new to, at least to the media and what people hear about and read about, some people who maybe weren't obviously studying it and researching it and things like that. I mean, do we have a lot of like, history to go off of that, something like that could kind of, I mean, obviously there's different things in life with, I'm sure he could have allegedly done things with alcohol or drugs or, steroids, even with athletes. It happens, right? I mean, could this have been some kind of cocktail of combination of things that could have led him to this, do you think? Or you think it's not even, realistic to talk about and discuss with CTE and his actions?
I mean, honestly, as you say, right, we're becoming more and more familiar with what CTE really is. I mean, in the past, it was sort of known that people who engaged in contact sports would sort of develop these kinds of cognitive issues. I mean, it used to be called dementia pugilistic, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of known that people who would experience repeated trauma to the head would develop these problems, but only recently has it been evaluated, or has it been shown that a very large percentage of former NFL players will develop CTE. And so, for example, there was a study that showed 87 out of 91 tested former NFL players, they tested positive for CTE, and then 131 out of 165 people who just played football seriously, like either professionally, semi-professionally, or like in college or even in high school, tested positive for CTE. And then a more recent study came out that showed remarkably that 110 out of 111 former NFL players were found to have had CTE. And since we don't really know who that last remaining person was, we don't really know why that person might not have developed it.
Right.
But it's just becoming clearer and clearer that this is a significant issue for people who engage in contact sports.
So is it, as far as CTE, just before we change subject, I know it's not really something that you focus on entirely with your research and whatnot, but is there a way from what little that we know, I guess at this point, to avoid CTE, as far as like a certain age to start doing these things at, or any way to avoid it, like taking a break from certain things, or is it just it's too much of a mystery still?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, there aren't a lot of studies that have shown like successful ways to prevent the development of CTE, right? And so kind of the problem is that CTE requires time to develop, requires, right, repeated subconcussive injuries to the head or concussions. And so, the simplest thing would be just stop engaging in whatever is causing the head trauma. But of course not, that's sort of an unrealistic prescription. And so the only study of which I'm familiar has shown that if you essentially immobilize the head following some kind of trauma to the head, that has been associated with a reduced likelihood of developing CTE. But it's going to take some time for us to really understand, useful strategies to prevent the onset.
Right. And I know there have been instances where, the brain and, maybe an issue with it of some sort have been used in cases, kind of like kids, like a murder case or something like that. Is that, going to be something we see more of, you think, in the future with, in courts and stuff?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying in courts and in trials, will we see more of that being used as a reason for things that are being done and happening?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's, I don't have like a list of examples that it's been brought up, but I mean, lawyers are increasingly using things like fMRI scans, basically brain scans, to essentially argue that, my client ought not be culpable because there was some, brain disease that compelled them to commit these acts. And in fact, that has basically spurred this really, really contentious debate within neuroscience as to whether or not that evidence ought to be considered legitimate, and whether or not the the judicial system is really well equipped to successfully evaluate the validity of those claims. And then, of course, it very rapidly descends into a discussion of whether or not anybody ought to be considered culpable or punished for these acts,
right? Because
a brain disease is just one very specific expression of the relationship between something occurring in the brain being associated with some horrible act. right? And so, you know, that's a long conversation that we can have. But the short story is, yes, I mean, there are even like departments of neural law that are emerging among certain universities, and you know, the university at which I work is one of them.
Wow. And I think you may have mentioned it on your last podcast, something about that, right? With even addiction, some calling it a disease, and then you know, whether they can, how they can proceed moving forward with that, whether it is a disease, whether it's not, right? I mean, you mentioned that in the last podcast, right?
Yeah. So that is another very contentious debate, and it is sort of related, right? You know, just how in control of our actions are we? And there is a very contentious debate within neuroscience as to whether or not addiction should be considered a disease or a disorder. And there's a very interesting history to that debate, which, you know, I'm happy to go into. But more recently, a pretty well-known neuroscientist, the chair, I believe, of is it psychology at Columbia University? His name is Carl Hart. He has argued that not only is addiction not a disease, but it's prejudice to claim that it's a disease. But then, of course, there are, you know, there's NIDA, for example, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, which is a part of the NIH. Their whole like foundation is that addiction is absolutely a brain disease. It's called the brain disease model of addiction. And so, yeah, this is clearly a contentious debate, much more contentious than it might seem. And so yeah, it's definitely related.
A lot of fighting going on in the brain science world. You don't think about it, you know, but it's funny that there is.
Yeah, dude. I mean, like so for example, I'll bring it up with, you know, so my PhD work is focused on understanding the sort of mapping out the circuitry in the brain that's associated with addiction, as well as with sort of anxiety and mood in general. And so I'll bring up this question with my colleagues, you know, and say, like, what do you think? And while most of them haven't really thought too much about it, when I start that conversation, there are very divergent opinions, and it got pretty heated at a certain point. Like, how could you possibly think that it's a disease? Or, you know, and then others being like, how could you possibly not? You know, and so yeah. I mean, this is something that's probably going to be gamed out a lot more in the coming years. But I mean, it's been a debate for decades.
Wow, that's so interesting, and I guess it should be. And I guess this is probably I'm assuming it's a stupid question. I have no idea. I think it's a stupid question, but like, what's the difference in the brain itself between stuff like CTE and then say addiction or even depression? Like, is one chemical and one's physical? Is that what it is, or what's like the difference there?
That's definitely not a stupid question.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, because it's very complicated. I mean, so some people in my position would argue that there really is no significant difference, right? That, you know, whether or not, you know, something that's chemical in the brain is something that's physical.
Right.
It's just a question of how obviously physical is it, right? So, for example, you know, a brain tumor, right? That's a very obvious physical manifestation of a disease, right? But addiction, some would argue, is associated with, you know, you've inherited certain genetic predispositions to enjoying the effects of, let's say, morphine. You know, some people hate morphine, and some people really enjoy morphine or oxycodone. Right. And so some would argue that given the fact that we know that there's a relationship between an inherited set of genes and an increased risk of developing addiction, then really what's the difference, right? But then others would argue that, well, the difference is that, you know, things like depression or things like addiction require for the environment to intervene, right? So, for example, you know, some folks who develop depression, they were severely traumatized as a child. Or, of course, in the case of addiction, right, you're never going to develop nicotine addiction if you've never been exposed to nicotine,
right?
But then the defense to that is, well, many tumors require for there to be exposure to some, you know, mutagen, exposure to too much ultraviolet radiation, for example, or, you know, just some toxic environmental component that then is what causes the tumor to develop. So these are very complicated debates.
Interesting. So, okay. So I guess my question wasn't stupid. So that's a good thing.
Not at all.
That's a good thing. Before we get off of like the gloom of these things really quick, with stuff like what just happened in Vegas with the shooter and that unfortunate stuff. And then you got people who like commit suicide and things. I was always wondering, like, you hear with these things when they happen, people who either knew them or, you know, were familiar with them. They say, you know, I didn't see this coming, or, you know, he or she was really happy. I can't imagine that this, you know, that they would do this. Is it really possible for things like that to go so unnoticed by people around them, or are we just ignoring things?
Well, honestly, yeah. So, I mean, you're referring to, you know, Stephen Paddock, who committed the atrocity in Las Vegas, and you know, we're still learning about him. There's not a lot in his past that would seem to have been very many red flags. I mean, like, I think the only recorded incident with law enforcement before that was like a minor traffic citation a few years ago. And, some would argue that, a proclivity towards gambling might be, a red flag that somebody's developing something, in their brain. But he had evidently been playing, video poker for over 25 years.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like there was this unusual uptick in risk-seeking behavior or like impulse control problems that we're aware of. There's, the fact that he was a recluse, but a lot of people are reclusive.
Right.
And, and so it's just that there's not a lot of obvious red flags. And as a result, right when I sort of started learning about or reading about his history, it sort of reminded me of another atrocity in the 60s committed by somebody named Charles Whitman, who he was similar. He was described as somebody who like rarely lost his temper. He was described as intelligent. He went to UT Austin for mechanical engineering, and while there was he wasn't a particularly stellar student there. Like there really wasn't any any flare-ups with law enforcement, or he wasn't like particularly violent. But then he in 1966, the day before the shooting that he committed, he killed both his mother and his wife. And then the next day, he climbed to the observation deck at UT Austin and killed 17 people, wounded 31 people over the course of 96 minutes.
Wow.
Right. And it's an interesting and kind of ghoulish story. But for example, he left a suicide note that had some really strange quotes. And so one of them was, quote, I do not quite understand what it is that compels me to this type, to type this letter. I'm sorry. And then quote, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks. And then after after the shooting, after autopsy, his brain was evaluated, and it was shown that he had a brain tumor surrounded by widespread areas of necrosis with vascular malformations and so on. And so while we can't really know if that was what was responsible for this incredible increase in violent thoughts and so on, given the location of all that pathology in the brain, it really does make it difficult to believe that there wouldn't be some relationship. And so in the case of Paddock, right, evidently some information from the autopsy has been released, but I think we're still waiting for a more comprehensive report that would include things like toxicology and deeper analyses of his biology.
Gotcha.
But again, it's just like it doesn't make sense. And in the case of Charles Whitman, okay, maybe the brain tumor might explain this. In the case of Paddock, it's like, yeah, it's hard to understand.
Yeah, it is. And I guess I just asked because even like, I guess I guess one of the important things to understand is that with these kind of mass, killings or even suicides or any of these kind of things, that every situation is literally its own special case, right? I mean, even when, people commit suicide, as horrible as it is, like some people have the whole world in front of them. They have money, happiness, love, but they still do that. Like, but each case is so individualized, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like oftentimes when a celebrity is found dead of an overdose, for example, everybody, the immediate thought is, how could that person possibly have been in such a situation that they would even entertain the notion of using these dangerous drugs? And it's because, the relationship between, addiction, mood, and, the environment, the number of relationships are massive, right? These are complicated interactions between, somebody's genome, somebody's brain architecture, and the environment. And so, and it is so difficult to understand the experience of somebody who has, a psychiatric illness that you don't have. It's so hard for somebody who's never suffered from depression to understand what depression is like.
Right.
And similarly, the same story with addiction. And so, yeah, it's hard to explain this abnormal behavior, particularly because it's so hard for us to imagine what it's like to be in their shoes.
Right. Yeah. And that's what, ends up happening most of the time is you just try to understand it. And like you said, unless you're that person, it's just, not easy to do. Obviously, like I said, so whenever we talk, there's so many different things to talk about. So I'm going to try to jump to different things really quick, just to kind of switch up because there's so many things I want to cover. So, you talked about on your podcast on the last one that you released on the Wired to Be Weird podcast. You talked about a funny story about MDMA or ecstasy, as most people know it as, like kind of a scandal around it. I wanted you to kind of talk about that because I always think those things are interesting because it's, people for some reason we like scandals and we like drama, and so I feel like it's something interesting to talk about. So would you share some of that with us?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, this revolves around one of the main study that was used to justify rendering MDMA as illegal as it is today. And so essentially, this is what prompted Congress to pass something that came to be known as the RAVE Act, right? Which is kind of cute, right? It's an acronym. It stands for Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act, and it's because MDMA was becoming particularly popular among people who went to raves,
right.
underground dance parties. They were trying to be cute there, but the short story is that this paper was published in one of the most important journals in science, called Science, and it was about the effects of MDMA on the brain. Right, this was in 2002, and the author claimed that they had identified substantial neurotoxicity induced by MDMA. Right, and he had nailed this down to its effects on dopamine levels, and that was an important finding. But importantly, it contradicted the findings of the rest of the field. So other scientists had found that MDMA is not associated with that kind of toxicity. And there was a back and forth. There were scientists who were questioning the validity of those results. But basically, it came out essentially a year later that study had actually been using methamphetamine,
wow,
which is known to be toxic due to dopaminergic activity, rather than MDMA. But still, that didn't stop, that didn't cause Congress to review the validity of the act that they had just passed. And essentially that law, or I don't know about that law, but this stance of the government, the perspective that they have of MDMA really hasn't changed, despite the fact that that law was based off of essentially scientific, misinformation.
Right.
And this involved a former director of NIDA who was basically saying, like, this proves that just one night of MDMA use is like playing Russian roulette with your brain.
Wow.
And so yeah, I mean, it's still very controversial, and it caused the scientific community to become very, very critical of that journal, Science, and then of course the former director of NIDA and so on.
It's funny because our country and science and drugs kind of have a long history with stuff like that, right? Like with, either bad information, not all of the information, to kind of like either outlaw things, make them worse than they are. Even like marijuana, right? I mean, there was like this attack on drugs, attack on marijuana, and like they made it sound like it was, the worst thing ever. Do you feel like, what is the reason for that from our country? Do you think it's mostly a money thing? Do you think it's a fear thing? Like, why do you think, you mentioned even science gets cherry picked a lot to kind of win arguments one way or the other. Why do you feel like that happens so often with science? And, what we think is like fact-based stuff, they kind of, I feel like if you give a fact and you say, this is a fact from science, people run with it, right? I mean, it's very easy to just run with it because you're like, well, science, of course, it's gotta be right. So like, why do you think that happens so often with science and our country?
Well, there's an interesting history written by a guy named David Courtwright, who's actually a historian. He's not a scientist, about basically the debate as to whether or not addiction is a disease or a disorder. And, basically he outlines the relationships between the different sort of stakeholders in drug law. And, scientists are just one of those stakeholders. Another very important stakeholder is law enforcement, and another is, politicians. And the reality is that over the past few decades, politicians have found that drugs have been a very effective campaign mechanism, right? And so, like there's this really remarkable video, you can see it on YouTube, of George H.W. Bush, right, the first President Bush. His first nationally televised video, right, after becoming president, he holds up a big bag of crack cocaine in the Oval Office.
Oh, wow.
That was essentially, that was evidently recovered nearby in Washington, D.C., and spends several minutes talking about the war on drugs. And, so the reality is, like, particularly as you, bring up cannabis, and MDMA, obviously, and so on, it's not like our drug laws are really based off of science, right? I mean, sometimes when science can be used to sort of justify certain legislative action or certain campaign rhetoric, then it'll be used. But what if it's not useful from a political perspective or a law enforcement perspective? There's just not a strong history of science guiding, changes or reform at the level of, legislation or law enforcement.
Yeah. I mean, like, you mentioned like even marijuana and stuff in sports. It's often mentioned that like players will say, they prefer to smoke weed or whatever it is for their pain rather than painkillers. And, it's obviously got this, this black cloud over it from, people's jobs, from sports organizations, culture, society, whatever it may be. And it seems like, we don't look at pain pills or these man-made drugs the same way we look at those things, but they tend to be worse than weed from what a lot of people hear or read. Do you think drugs, I know that a lot of times there's certain classes they're in, we can't even research them as much as we'd like or use them and apply them, but do you think that those things, like for instance weed in this case, would ever win from a law standpoint, kind of win that battle, if it's right? I mean, do you think it's right that it's better than pain pills, or do you think it'll ever have a chance to actually win that fight, or is it kind of never really going to be a never-ending battle, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's hard to be particularly optimistic about, like rational legislation or
Right.
drug law reform. But, and cannabis is a particularly complicated issue. And we talked a bit about this on my podcast a while ago. But the reality is, like, because there's so much hyperbole regarding cannabis on both sides, where, the prohibitionists will say, it'll cause you to develop schizophrenia and it's useless for everything and it'll make you lazy and stupid.
Right.
Like, that's all not true. I mean, there's a kernel of truth there in that there are certain people who have a predisposition to experiencing psychosis after smoking pot, but it's a small population.
We're back
and
to
we
like
know a lot
cherry
about the
picking, right?
genetics. I'm sorry, what's
We're
that?
back to cherry picking there in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. But then on the other side, and I get this all the time, the advocates of legalization of cannabis, well, not always, but oftentimes exaggerate, the utility of cannabis. They'll say things like cannabis, it cures cancer, it cures multiple sclerosis, it is, a more effective pain killer than the pharmaceutical painkillers. And again, there are kernels of truth to those things, but they're all exaggerations, right? So like and there are studies of the efficacy of cannabis in treating things like pain, chronic pain, and so on. But it's important to note that because, as you noted, cannabis is so illegal from a federal level, it's really hard to study cannabis. It's really hard to do good science when it comes to cannabis.
Right.
More recently, that's changing. But the evidence that we have at our disposal is that in some cases, cannabis can be effective at reducing chronic pain. In some cases, it can in fact be counterproductive. It can actually exacerbate pain. And so it's perhaps unsurprising when you learn about the physiology of the parts of our nervous system that cannabis interacts with, the endocannabinoid receptors. These are very, very complicated signaling systems. And so, and the genetics that, will sort of inform or sculpt how somebody responds to a given drug, those are also extraordinarily complicated. And so it's overly simplistic to suggest that, cannabis is more effective than pain pills for everybody. And because of that complexity, because there's so much nuance to this debate, I'm not particularly optimistic that anytime soon we'll have more rational, legislation surrounding cannabis. I mean, from my perspective, it should just be legalized for recreational use and regulated just like alcohol.
Right.
But because that's like sort of a non-starter at the federal level, it's hard to be optimistic.
That's so strange. I read this article today, I think it was today, maybe yesterday, today, about mushrooms and psilocybin in mushrooms. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but they were saying that it was like, I guess they did studies or research that it was successful in treating depression to a certain degree. I was kind of confused when I was reading it, though, because isn't psilocybin a psychoactive drug?
Well, sure. So, I mean, all of these drugs that we're talking about are psychoactive, right? So, I think you're referring to psychedelic,
Right,
right?
right, psychedelic type stuff. Yeah. So like, how does that help with other things when it kind of does other things? You know what I mean? Like, I guess it kind of loses me sometimes when I read stuff like that.
Um, so yeah, I mean, so magic mushrooms and psilocybin within magic mushrooms are indeed psychedelic drugs. And we call the psychedelics are a class of drugs that includes things like LSD or acid, mescaline. A lot of times these are drugs that we associate with the hippie generation in the
Right,
60s.
right,
And so, they cause these, among other things, they cause these sort of classic visual distortions that are called psychedelic hallucinations, right? And so, because that's such a unique set of effects, pretty much very few other drugs really induce those types of effects.
right.
That's sort of considered, I think, popular to be like the primary effect of these drugs. But these drugs also interact with other parts of the brain that don't just regulate things like visual and sensory perception in general. They also interact with mood circuitry. And so fairly recently, there's been a sort of resurgence in the interest of whether these psychedelic drugs could represent a sort of new strategy to target the brain circuitry that we know is involved in things like depression or PTSD. And so, those studies are ongoing, but you're right. There have been this sort of like this sort of trajectory of finding that there might be something to these drugs. There might be something to the use of psilocybin or other psychedelics in ameliorating the severity of depression, particularly in the cases of like treatment-resistant depression or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in cases where other treatments have been ineffective.
Right. Something like psilocybin, is that banned? It's a banned substance, like as far as law wise? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
okay,
Yeah, it's super illegal.
so when something like that is, you guys, they do these studies and they find that it does help in depression or whatever the case is, would that ever be able to be used by people, or is that something that we can't use because of the laws?
Well, magic mushrooms, they're a unique case because they're pretty easy to produce.
Okay.
It's not like LSD. Like LSD is actually pretty difficult to produce. It requires some pretty advanced organic chemistry. And so, it's perhaps a little bit easier to obtain magic mushrooms.
Right.
But, given the fact that there are these efforts at treating PTSD and so on with things like MDMA or things like psilocybin, and a lot of the evidence is positive. I think there will probably come a point where once the evidence is so overwhelming, right? If the evidence ever does become so overwhelming that these are uniquely useful in clinical settings, my only source of optimism would be when at that moment there might be a sort of a strong enough political contingent of folks who will just say, this is very important to us. Mental illness is a very important issue, and we want more resources. And, once the clinical world sort of adopts that perspective, again, assuming that the data or that the research supports, legalization of the use of these medications or the use of these drugs as medications, then perhaps there will be a change in law. But as of right now, yeah, it's very illegal. And the only way that somebody could sort of pursue this in a sort of sanctioned way would be, in a condoned way, right, by the federal government, would be participating in a clinical trial that's given the okay by the DEA.
Okay, gotcha. I guess we'll have to keep waiting, right? We'll just have to keep fighting for those things. Speaking of like your past podcasts and stuff, you did ones on Neuralink, man. That kind of freaked me out, man. They kind of scared me a little bit because I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm ready for, a world where this stuff is real, like where people could read your thoughts or make decisions for you and stuff like that. Obviously, I recommend people go back and listen to those because you had 2 episodes on them and it was, really in depth and lots of information and stuff. But anytime Elon Musk gets behind something, I get a little worried because if it's something I'm scared of, he's probably gonna get it done, right? So, like as far as that goes, because there's so much to unpackage with that. Like I said, I recommend people go listen to your podcast for more of it. But as far as Neuralink in itself or things like it, how far away do you honestly really think we are away from the stuff like that being possible? Like for real, like where people are gonna be able to use it?
Well, so we should say, so Neuralink is
Yeah,
a
explain
company that
it.
that was announced by Elon Musk, that the goal of which is to develop a whole brain computer interface. And so meaning, essentially integrating technology into the physiology of the nervous system. And they've made big bold claims, and they are very ambitious. And so if it was just Elon Musk saying like, I'm going to do this, then I'd be like, okay, we'll see. Although you're right, when he makes a claim, usually he does follow
Yeah.
through, even remarkable things. But his board has some serious neuroscience firepower. And I wish I had the list of people in front of me, but these are people who are involved in well-regarded research in neuroscience. And basically the board has, there's so many different ways to integrate technology into the brain. There's things like neural dust or neural lace. Basically, there's like, the injection of tiny little, what would be like, kind of like electrodes into different parts of the brain, or there's like the implantation of a mesh of electrodes. And so who knows which one will take off, if any one of them do. But ultimately, the goal is to have a computer be sensitive enough to the brain, to the activity in the brain, that it can then read that activity, decipher it, and then potentially allow for computers or other brains that have these technologies to then interact with those implanted electrodes, whatever they may be. In which case you would, the experience of a human in that situation would be so unlike what our day-to-day experience is, that it's hard to fathom what that would be like. And so when it comes to when this might happen, man, those predictions are always wrong. So I because it's such a monumental task to be able to measure more than just a couple neurons at one time in vivo. I can't imagine it happening even within the next century.
Wow.
But
Okay.
who knows? All it will take is just like sort of some remarkable invention that then does enable this to happen very rapidly. And so but I would imagine perhaps within our lifetime, or maybe just after our lifetime.
That'd be so cool, right? When you think about stuff like that too, you think about like like you said, like if it gets into the wrong hands, or what people will do with it. There's so much. Like I said, I recommend people go listen to your podcast because it was fun, both those episodes. So I don't know, it's just so much stuff there. But like I said, man, when Elon gets behind something, I think it's gonna happen. So I can't doubt him. I also seen this thing today on an article about brain stimulation. It was, I can read the big words here and try to act like I know, but it was high definition transcranial alternating current stimulation. I think I did pretty good saying that.
Yeah.
But something about like turbocharging the brain and I guess the things that control the learning of our brain. Are you familiar with all this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, this isn't research that I do, but transcranial direct current stimulation, or alternating current stimulation, this is also a fairly contentious topic within neuroscience, and it's been contentious for a long time, but it was rendered more contentious when there was a study in a cadaver. And it was a pretty remarkable scene where basically these two scientists set up this cadaver and then implanted like hundreds of electrodes into the brain of this cadaver, right? And then they basically applied this transcranial direct current stimulation. That was the platform they were using, which basically the concept is that you're applying these changes, this current, electrical current, outside of the skull, out on the sort of surface layer of the skin, right on the scalp, basically. Mm-hmm. And the goal is to inject enough current so that you alter the activity of the brain, but not too much current that you start burning the skin, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's like, it's electricity.
Right.
And so what these two guys showed was that almost none of the current actually gets into the brain to alter neural activity. And there are some arguments like, the advocates of the platform will say, yeah, we know that. Like, it's not like we think we're changing the activity of the whole brain. And all you need is a nudge here or there to have an effect. But then, critics will say, well, that's like nothing, so that almost has no effect.
Right.
And so I am sort of pretty skeptical of the ability for these platforms to have a very significant effect on your sort of conscious experience. And mostly that's because I'm a bit of a chauvinist for deeper brain structures. These, things like transcranial direct current stimulation and alternating current stimulation, they're only able to affect the very, very outer layers of the brain. And that's very important, but it's missing out on the vast majority of the brain.
Right.
And some of the most important structures are buried deeply beneath the surface layer of the brain. So that's why I'm fairly skeptical, but I don't know. I haven't seen this most recent thing that you're talking about. So maybe there was some crazy innovation that I hadn't seen.
I mean, you would probably, obviously break it down a lot better than me. If I read it, I'd probably be like, oh, it's happening. And you'd be like, not happening. So I'll go with you on that one. Do you feel the same way? Are you that, questionable about stuff like nootropics, smart drugs, all that stuff? Is it all the same? Does it all fall in the same category for you?
No, I mean, not in the same category. So nootropics, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, but basically this is an informal category of supplements, right? And they're not they're not pharmaceuticals, right? They're supplements. And as such, they're regulated differently than drugs. And so as a result, right, I could, come out with this product like Ian's magical white powder, Ian's magical charm powder that makes you more charming and more attractive. And so long as I don't, try and get it marketed as a drug, and so long as I don't poison people immediately, right, when they take it, I can sell that illegally.
That's scary. That's pretty scary, but
Yeah, exactly. And so that doesn't mean that all of the nootropics are complete BS, right? It just means that the standard of proof is much lower than it is for, pharmaceutical drugs. And so for people who are skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, you ought to be more skeptical of the supplement industry. But again, that doesn't mean that it's all BS. And so, for example, advocates of nootropics, and by the way, we should say nootropics are this category of supplements that are marketed to improve cognition or brain performance, brain health. And, advocates of nootropics will point to very specific studies and say, this study has shown that, they'll point to a study, for example, that shows an effect in improving something called verbal recall in, a majority, more than half of 20 people. And then advocates that, the company that uses that study to sell their product will say, well, then here we go, right? This product improves your ability to speak. But the problem is that if you were very scrupulous in evaluating what that research actually says, basically a lot of this research is like in a very specific population that are at like a sleep deficit or that are over the age of 65, right? Or at a nutritional deficit. And, when it comes to like a clinical trial for a drug, right, that will ultimately involve thousands of people, whereas most of these studies for nootropics only involve dozens of people at best.
Right. It's crazy because there's like people that sell these things like you said, and they do their studies and try to prove it as best they can, I guess, right? But there's people that like I hear and they talk about it, and they act like it's really working, and I never know, like, are they trying to sell you something here, or are these people legitimately getting something from this, or is it just that that effect where you're taking something and they tell you it's doing something, so you think it's doing something. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. The placebo effect.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think there are probably plenty of benign actors in that world who really do believe that this product is having an effect. And by the way, it could very well be having that effect, and maybe we just don't have the science to reveal that effect yet.
Right.
But because that data doesn't exist, I'm not just going to believe somebody just because I want to believe them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, okay, so you're a smart guy. You're way smarter than me.
I'm not.
You are. You are. Listen, when I hear you talk, I'm always like, this guy knows so much stuff. Like, I don't know how you retain it and all that, but, so it's probably easier to impress me with things than it would be for you. But, from all your, your research and all this, in-depth stuff that you do, has there ever been anything that, I guess for lack of a better term, has blown your mind? Like when I hear, scientists talk or, physicists, and I'm like, whoa, they just blow my mind, everything I hear. But like for you, has there ever been a moment where you were like, wow, like you were actually like blown away by something? Or is it kind of like, oh, well, I can see that happening?
Absolutely. At different levels. Like, so most regularly it's when I'm around scientists who are so obviously brilliant, just the way that they craft a series of experiments is so elegant and simple and what we call parsimonious in science. It's as simple as it could be to achieve to achieve the, the outcome that you need. That is what regularly blows my mind. It's very humbling.
Right.
But then in terms of just like the wow factor, like, whoa, you're like a sorcerer. Like it's really the people who are developing the new tools to do studies in neuroscience. So for example, like, optogenetics or chemogenetics, or, these new platforms that enable us to ask questions that, just 5 years ago, we never could have asked. And so that's what really blows my mind. I mean, when people develop a technology that is just such a departure from what existed before, that it's just like, wow, okay, like you are playing at a different level.
Right, right. So that's what gets you going. Like, whoa, man. Because I always wonder that. Because I obviously, if I could just watch a YouTube video and someone say something, I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I was always wondering, like, what gets Ian surprised, shocked, amazed by stuff. Also, Periscope, right? So you're on Periscope a lot. That's where I first found you or seen you or heard from you. It seems like, when you're on there, obviously you're getting drilled with tons of questions everyone wants answers to. Alzheimer's, dementia, that comes up a lot, like a lot. So you get your share of those kind of questions. I was recently at a party, and there was a friend of the family there, and this person, I was talking to them. I didn't know that there was any kind of issue. And then they asked me the same question like twice, like we never discussed it. And I was like, wow, that's scary. I see what's going on here, There's a lot of people who are dealing with stuff like that, right? With family members that are like that or whatnot. In that field of things with dementia and Alzheimer's and stuff, like what has there been anything, because I know it's so much in that field, is there anything to point to that actually does cause those things or makes those things happen more often than not or anything like that? Or is it still kind of a mystery?
Well, there's definitely still more. Well, we know a lot more today than, of course, we've ever known about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which is the most frequent cause of dementia. It is also true that there are the rates of diagnosis of dementia have increased really significantly over the past few years, and that's for sort of predictable demographic reasons, right? We have the sort of aging demographic, the baby boomers, right? Where they're getting up to the age where age-associated pathologies become more frequent, dementia being one of those. And we do know a lot about some of the causes of dementia. So, we know about some of the earliest, if you picture the development of something like Alzheimer's as a string of dominoes, right? We know a lot about, we can basically explain the second, third, and fourth, and so on domino, right? Okay. And in some cases, we can explain that first domino with genetics, right? But that's actually a small population within the whole population of folks with dementia. And so essentially the strategy, and it's been super difficult for a variety of reasons to target that first domino, right? For sort of technical reasons and strange biological reasons that we can talk about if you want, but they're sort of nitty gritty. But now the focus over in the history of neuroscience has been on treating Alzheimer's once it manifests, right? So somebody goes to the doctor, they are evaluated for dementia, and they're diagnosed with dementia, and then they're treated, right? And so the majority of the effort has been to develop new treatments for that person in that situation. The problem is that over the several decades, there really haven't been really substantial innovations in treating it once it exists.
So just hold on one second. So when you say treating, obviously there's no cure. So when you say treating, do you mean like to slow it down or to kind of offset it a little bit? What do you mean when you say treat it?
That's exactly, yeah. Okay. So you slow it down, treat reduce the severity of the disease, potentially try and reverse the disease.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's where most of the efforts have been. But because it's been so difficult and some amazingly remarkable strategies have been pursued, like it's like tricking your immune system to attack the things that are causing dementia, things like that, really innovative stuff. Because they haven't been particularly successful, now the strategy is geared more towards prevention. And so now more and more scientists are focused on that exact question that you raised. So what is it that we can do to prevent dementia? Can we predict, for example, if you are at an increased risk of dementia? And if so, what are the strategies, be them pharmaceutical or therapeutic or whatever it might be, that would reduce your predisposition to developing dementia? And so, there are things that are being evaluated like lifestyle factors, like, how socially isolated are you, or how much do you exercise? What kind of food do you eat? What's your nutrition, your diet like? And there's some studies that have been done, in years past focus on these things. But now I think there's going to be an increased effort to really try and parse these things out. And so, I would imagine that in the coming years, we're going to learn more and more about, for example, the genetics that are associated with Alzheimer's. We know a bit about that, but there's more to be discovered, as well as the environmental factors that sort of increase the risk of developing dementia.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely scary stuff, until you like deal with someone who is dealing with it. I was like, I never really, to be honest with you, I don't really bump into a lot of people who have it, or that I know of, at least. But in this conversation, it was so apparent, and I was like, whoa, like that was like, it was kind of scary, and I felt bad for the guy, and I felt scared, like, dang, this is real. This is really happening in front of me, like I was like, wow,
it's devastating. And I think that that's also true for most psychiatric illnesses. Right? If you don't know anybody that's addicted to a drug, or you don't know anybody with depression, then it's such an abstract concept.
Right.
And I think, by the way, that's part of the reason for why people will oftentimes try and explain things like these massacres by saying, oh, they're just mentally ill.
Right.
When in reality, the vast majority of people diagnosed with psychiatric disorders never commit violent acts. And by the way, they're an increased vulnerability of violence. Right. In other words, they're more likely to be aggressed upon than aggress.
Wow.
And so yeah, these personal experiences, can totally change your perspective on an illness like these things.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely scary stuff. But like you said, there's people hard at work trying to figure it out. And you did mention, like when you said ways to possibly prevent it, you mentioned diet. Is there certain foods? Because again, it kind of goes back to all these different ways to, to sharpen the brain or to whatever. Is there any really real brain foods that you guys would recommend, or that you recommend that, has been proven to really help the brain in any way, shape or form? And not even to prevent dementia, but just in general to help your focus or attention or anything like that?
It's funny. I think you could call this podcast like Neuroscience is contentious, because this is, a heated debate within biology and biomedical science. For a very long time, the diet that was recommended by, research scientists and physicians alike was the Mediterranean diet, or a sort of a tweak to that diet called the MIND diet, which is kind of like a blending of two different types of diets. And basically that diet revolved around, nothing surprising, it revolved around green leafy vegetables, nuts and seeds, lean proteins like, poultry or fish, unsaturated fats, things like olive oil rather than butter and animal fat. And then in the Mediterranean diet, it called for a glass of red wine every now and then. But more recently, it's been shown that a lot of the evidence that supported the argument that saturated fat is bad for you was not particularly the strongest evidence. The one thing, and so as a result, I can't just say, oh yeah, the Mediterranean diet, just do that and you won't develop dementia and you'll live forever, right? But the one thing that pretty much is pretty uncontentious is the fact that highly refined carbohydrates, in other words, like sugar, it's really not good. There's really no good reason to consume carbohydrates in that form. And it's probably the culprit for a lot of sort of public health issues associated with diet.
Wow. Yeah. I guess sugar just really isn't good for anything, huh? I mean,
yeah.
I guess it feels good or whatever, mentally or chemically, whatever in that moment, but it's just not good, man. All right. So cool. So, I mean, we've covered a lot of the stuff that, I definitely wanted to, get out there and kind of go over. Like you said, it's a lot of battle in there, man. In neuroscience, there's a lot going on. You don't think about it unless you dig in. As far as, with your, like you said, you focus your research stuff on addiction and all these things. Is there anything, within your research that you specifically do that on Periscope and podcasts and stuff that you don't get asked, but that you do want to talk about, or that you feel like you wish more people would ask about?
Oh man, that's interesting. I've never even thought about that. Well, I mean, there's one thing that is kind of difficult to communicate, because you almost have to demonstrate it, and that is that that I think that there's this expectation that that understanding the brain should be like other sciences, right? And so if we went to the moon, then we should be able to understand the brain,
right?
And the reality is that you really can't make those comparisons. And, and like I said, in the recent years, there's been the introduction of these new tools, some of which I use in my research, that enables us to ask questions that we never could have asked, 10 years ago. And so as a result, the delay between being able to ask those questions and then coming to practical, findings, actionable findings in biomedical science, that delay is pretty substantial. And so it's frustrating, but we need to have some patience when it comes to, the work of scientists in my position and improving the quality of life in folks who are suffering from things like addiction or depression. So it's just, science is messy. It takes time. It requires for there to be mistakes that happen to then ultimately come together as a consensus and say, yes, sugar is bad for you.
Right.
And so, yeah, I know that that's not, and the reason it's hard to communicate is that, like, well, show me, prove it. Why? We went to the moon. Why can't you just do this? And it's like,
Right.
I know it's the process that takes time.
Right. Okay. So you want us to know that there's a process to this, that patience is important, man. And it's important in everything in life, really. So, I appreciate that. I just thought I'd ask, because, a lot of times people are just constantly asking you for what they want and never letting you give what you want. You know what I mean? So I figured I wanted to ask that.
Yeah. And I should say, like, one thing. So I've started recently doing like a live call-in where people can call a number that I put on the screen. And then we have like longer conversations. And I have to say that has really, I think, improved the complexity of the conversation. So, I can get feedback from the person asking the question. They can tell me their story. Like, for example, in the most recent call-in episode I did, there was somebody who called in that was basically, he was being treated for back pain with opiates. And basically, he was like a perfect example of somebody who's just taking the first steps down the road to addiction. He was saying, like, what's the problem with me just taking these pills that make me feel so good? What's philosophically wrong with that? And we would just go back and forth and back and forth. And it was just this perfect encapsulation of the, what is the opioid addiction epidemic. So many people in this country are making those decisions and having that inner dialogue. And so that has, I think, improved the sort of the depth of conversation.
Yeah. And it's one, painkillers and opioids and other things. It's a weird thing. Like, and I guess everyone's different with it. I don't know what it is, but like even painkillers, like say you get a tooth pulled and they try to give you certain painkillers, like I get nauseous from that stuff. And I always think to myself, how do people get addicted to these things? You know what I mean? I'm always like, what is wrong with me that I don't get what they're getting? Like I don't know what that is. And I'm like, what is going on here? Is that a brain thing or is that a body reaction? What is that?
That's an awesome thing to bring up. And actually, we're going to talk about that to a fair depth in the next podcast episode. But basically, what we would call that is that you've inherited a protection against opioid addiction, right? So some people, they react like you. They get nauseous, they feel stupid, they're sort of just slow and dizzy. And there's no way that something that causes all of those things is going to be super fun to do.
Yeah, that's what I always think whenever I'm like, no, you can't prescribe this to me. I can't do it. I need something else. It's not going to work. This is not going to work.
Right. And another example of that is called the alcohol flush or the Asian flush. Oftentimes it's called, where some people, it's particularly prevalent in Northeastern Asia, where just a small amount of alcohol will cause their skin, mostly their face and sort of shoulders and area to turn very, very red, beet red. And then some of them will also get very nauseous, and it's almost like an immediate hangover. Wow. And so as a result, these folks very rarely develop alcoholism. And so, that is a brain thing. That's a genetic thing. Wow. And we're learning more and more about why it is that somebody like in your position, why it is that you respond to, hydrocodone or whatever with nausea, whereas other people, they feel better than they've ever felt in their life.
That is crazy. And that's why I think the brain and all this stuff is so interesting, man. It's just so deep. It's so much depth to it and so much to figure out. One other thing before I let you go here is with Periscope and with your podcast and all these things. I mean, even with the call-in thing that you're doing now, I mean, I think it would be even cool in podcast form, right? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but did you ever see this happening? Like the way social media or voice or video would be a part of, your journey in neuroscience and the research that you do and what you're trying to achieve. Did you ever see that happening, becoming so popular?
Absolutely not.
It's crazy, right? I mean, that might be a wow moment for you, right? Like people really want to hear this, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's continues to be surprising. But I think because there's this opportunity, there's some recent studies by MIT that showed that, like, in this country, there is such a polarization of where people are getting their information from. Certain people watch only certain channels and only, subscribe to certain whatever magazines or go on, certain websites, right? And others do completely different ones. And you can essentially live in a universe that is entirely insulated from a different universe in this country. And I think that when it comes to things like, Periscope or, platforms like Periscope, it is this opportunity to break through that polarization, break through that insulation, and have a conversation with people who, for example, have never met a scientist in their life and probably never would.
Right.
Or people in countries where, discussing things like, mental health is tantamount to breaking the law, And so yeah, I mean, I think that perhaps is why this has been at least very rewarding for me, and then hopefully rewarding for people who are on the viewer side.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important what you do. A lot of people do podcasts for entertainment purposes or whatever, but the fact that you're educating people and making it interesting or fun while doing it, I think is super important. And one of the things I like about you is that you're not afraid to discuss any topic, or you don't shy away from things. Even I want to say it was a call-in on your Periscope where someone was mentioning like erectile dysfunction or something, and like they didn't want to say it. They didn't want to say it, but you were like, you can say it. I mean, like you're not shying away from anything. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny, but you got good stuff, man. For anyone listening right now who doesn't do the Periscope thing or your podcast, or can you tell them where to find you, how to support you, your work, all that kind of good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So the podcast is called Wired to be Weird, and it's on, iTunes and Stitcher and a bunch of ones that I've forgotten what they're called. But it's probably available on whatever platform you use. And then I'm at _anthropoid on Twitter, and yeah, just connect. And I love talking about these things, so feel free to contact me.
And the username on Periscope is the same as the Twitter handle, right? If they're looking for you there.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Okay, good. Okay, perfect. And then I always like to ask you also if people are looking to help in neuroscience in any way, shape, or form, if they obviously haven't gone through the studies and things you have. Is there a place to donate money or time or effort or anything like that?
Well, I mean, for me personally, not at least not yet. I'm trying to think of ways that I could use that kind of support to more effectively deliver information.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not quite there yet.
Gotcha.
But when it comes to the sort of the endeavor of science, it's important to remember that the science that I do and the science that scientists who are far more capable than I am do, they're supported by the public, right? In other words, by taxes. And so, I know it's like hard to like keep up with politics and stuff like that, but in particular, when people talk about cutting the budget to the NIH or to the NSF or NASA or whatever it might be, that is essentially saying that people in my position are not going to get funding. Right. And so there will be fewer scientists asking these questions. And in the case of biomedical science, fewer scientists who are hoping to improve the quality of life of people outside of science and scientists as well. And so, just keep in mind that the budget for the NIH, the budget for the NSF, that is exactly what is used to generate these discoveries. So, just if you have a habit of contacting your representatives, or if you don't have a habit yet, you should start one because they're working for you.
Right.
I would just argue you should, say that it's a personal priority that biomedical science continues to get funded. Yeah.
And let me ask you one thing then before you go. Like I've done things where, say, we'll sell T-shirts or we'll do some kind of charity thing. And I think I mentioned it to you when I wanted to do a donation, even no matter how small it is, to like a mental health situation or whatever it was. I think I brought up the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, which is where I donated the funds that we had to. But is there any like those kind of foundations or anything that people that you feel really good about people donating to, that you feel do a lot of good with it, or is it just more about telling your congressman and stuff like that to up the budgets?
Oh yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I wish that I had prepared a good list. You know what?
Maybe you can
I'll get back to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe you can get back to me, and then when I post this up on on the website on clouddodgers.com and stuff, maybe I can put that list on there or something.
For sure. Yeah, because there are plenty of organizations that are doing really important things, whether it be and they're probably doing something that's important to you to someone's personal experience, right. Be it opioid addiction or MDMA, like drug purification, making sure people aren't just taking toxic drugs, or, obviously just addiction in general. And there are some great organizations. And yeah, I'll get back to you, Neal.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, Ian, I appreciate it, man. Like I said, it's always fun talking with you. I got a bunch of new one-liners to throw at people now to sound like I'm smarter than I am. So I appreciate it. Everyone knows where to find you. I highly encourage them to do that. And thank you, man. You have a good day, man.
It's my pleasure. You too.
Thank you. Well, I'll be damned if you didn't come away a little smarter after that one. Shout out to Ian McLaughlin again. Guys, seriously, follow him on Twitter at _anthropoid, ANTHROPOID. I like how that's like even the letters. You can just do 2 at a time and it ends perfectly. I like that. Follow him on there. Follow him on Periscope, where you get a real great connection with him as far as if you have any questions and stuff, he'll answer them like directly for you. So do that. Subscribe to the podcast Wired to be Weird. Again, can't recommend it enough. And just, follow him and everything and do what you can. Support science, support neuroscience, all the things that he mentioned. Again, it's really important to us. We've done things for mental health, and we want to continue to do things like that. It's a big thing to us. It's a big deal. Mental health, addiction, understanding the brain, understanding the way we work. It's really important here to Clock Dodgers. So it's always nice to have Ian on. He'll be on again in the future. You can guarantee it. If you do have any questions for Ian and you don't want to shoot it over to him on Twitter or something because you're lazy, I understand. Feel free to message me, email me, and I can either get the question over to him whenever, or I can use it for the next podcast. Just mention it somewhere in the email or on Twitter, DM, whatever you do, and I will store that away and make sure we use it. Again, that's Ian McLaughlin. Thank you again for coming on, my friend. It's always a good conversation. For those who didn't hear it in the intro, maybe you skipped over it. I know how some of you roll. We ain't gotta play that game. I know how some of you roll, skipping the intros and stuff. YouKaren.com. You guys can actually follow the link on my social media. You'll see it tweeted somewhere, or on Instagram, you'll see it mentioned. If you just click the link, you can donate. It's Toys for Tots. You're going to hear me talking about it a lot between now and when we, officially close it out. So all I ask is that you guys donate however you can, whatever you can. I can promise you, from someone who was involved in it last year, that it was really impactful. Really impactful. I mean, we went to the warehouse where they had all the toys. The Marines were there, and they kind of showed us around, and it was toys stacked to the ceiling. It was ridiculous. And like, just to know the impact that's going to have on kids it's I don't know how to explain it unless I tell you to do it, and if you can't donate money, that's fine. Donate time, maybe volunteer to help out at the places near you. Just whatever it is. Toys for Tots is a great program. But if you guys just go to my social media, you can click the link and donate right then and there. We're starting a little early just so we have enough time to to get as much as we can. Last year, I want to say we did like almost $1,000, so we're trying to do more than that this year. But the $1,000 went a long way. We were like little coupon cutters and stuff. I mean, we were doing everything to make it stretch, to get as much as we could from it. So it's a good thing to do. It really makes you feel good. It's a great cause, and I highly recommend you guys participate. And of course, nohalftime.com. They are the sponsor of the Clock Dodgers podcast. If you play daily fantasy sports and you're not playing No Halftime, I can guarantee that you're not playing the most, I don't know how to say this. It's the most different of any daily fantasy sports that you're playing. It's the most unique. I personally feel like it gives you the best opportunity to win money if you do things right. You know what I mean? Because you don't have to gamble on all these guys hitting and using all these salary caps and all these crazy things. You just pick players. You just do players. Tom Brady versus Russell Wilson. Straight up. Deshaun Jackson versus Larry Fitzgerald. You just do these challenges, and it could be against your friends, your family, ways to settle, scores and beef that you have with each other. If you want to do it for free, you can, but everything's better with money involved, right? So what I'm doing for you guys is I'm giving you the promo code CLOCK, CLOCK. When you sign up and make your first deposit, you'll get a bonus on your first deposit. And what can I say, folks? What can I say? Do it. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And anytime, like I said, money is involved, things get fun. They get interesting. And like I said, we have episodes that we talk about that we give like tips and stuff for No Halftime. If you have any questions, you can always hit me up directly. You guys know I love talking sports with you guys, so if you ever have any questions, you can always just hit me up directly and we can really discuss it that way. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Come on inside. Come inside. Keep making room. Come on. There's still more room. Keep moving over. Move over. Make room for the people coming in. Come on. Keep squeezing in. Come on. All right. We're there. We're there. Welcome to episode 90 of the Clock Dodgers podcast. I am your host, Neal. I have a guest with me today, a returning guest, none other than Ian McLaughlin. You know him if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast. He is a PhD student in neuroscience. I first ran into Ian on Periscope, which is the video streaming app where you can kind of conversate with people through the app itself. And so he's on there a lot and he's communicating with people through there and connecting with people. He actually even lets you call in. We talk about it a little bit on the episode, but he's a PhD student in neuroscience, really smart dude. And so the conversations are always really enriching. You know, there's a lot that we learn in these conversations with Ian, a lot of interest and stuff discussed. I like bringing Ian on, and people like Ian because, as you guys know, mental health is a big thing in our lives today, and addiction and these kind of things that maybe we don't fully understand yet, or that we do have a good idea of some of these things, but he always kind of sheds light on those things. He makes it interesting. He makes it fun as it can be in certain topics. But we get to go deep with Ian all the time and go really deep into good topics and conversations. So I always enjoy Ian coming on. For you guys who like to look at the guests before you listen to the episode, if you're not familiar with him, you can find him at _anthropoid. That's ANTHROPOID. Whew, some letters there. That's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. Definitely check him out there, though. Also, I highly recommend his podcast, which is Wired to be Weird. You guys know I only bring on guests that I really feel like are good conversations for you guys, have good information for you guys, and I would never recommend their, obviously, I wouldn't recommend their podcast or anything if I didn't believe in it, if I didn't enjoy it. And his podcast is fantastic. So Wired to be Weird is the podcast you want to subscribe to, and you can find that on all the different podcasts and platforms that you can find Clock Dodgers on. So go check that out for sure. I always appreciate you guys supporting those guests that come on the show because I'm a big fan of those people. I'm good friends with those people, and I want you guys to be as well because we're all family, right? So go do that, please. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to mention No Halftime, which is a daily fantasy sports app where you get Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Come on inside. Come inside. Keep making room. Come on. There's still more room. Keep moving over. Move over. Make room for the people coming in. Come on. Keep squeezing in. Come on. All right. We're there. We're there. Welcome to episode 90 of the Clock Dodgers podcast. I am your host, Neal. I have a guest with me today, a returning guest, none other than Ian McLaughlin. You know him if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast. He is a PhD student in neuroscience. I first ran into Ian on Periscope, which is the video streaming app where you can kind of conversate with people through the app itself. And so he's on there a lot and he's communicating with people through there and connecting with people. He actually even lets you call in. We talk about it a little bit on the episode, but he's a PhD student in neuroscience, really smart dude. And so the conversations are always really enriching. You know, there's a lot that we learn in these conversations with Ian, a lot of interest and stuff discussed. I like bringing Ian on, and people like Ian because, as you guys know, mental health is a big thing in our lives today, and addiction and these kind of things that maybe we don't fully understand yet, or that we do have a good idea of some of these things, but he always kind of sheds light on those things. He makes it interesting. He makes it fun as it can be in certain topics. But we get to go deep with Ian all the time and go really deep into good topics and conversations. So I always enjoy Ian coming on. For you guys who like to look at the guests before you listen to the episode, if you're not familiar with him, you can find him at _anthropoid. That's ANTHROPOID. Whew, some letters there. That's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. Definitely check him out there, though. Also, I highly recommend his podcast, which is Wired to Be Weird. You guys know I only bring on guests that I really feel like are good conversations for you guys, have good information for you guys, and I would never recommend their, obviously I wouldn't recommend their podcast or anything if I didn't believe in it, if I didn't enjoy it. And his podcast is fantastic. So Wired to Be Weird is the podcast you want to subscribe to, and you can find that on all the different podcasts and platforms that you can find Clock Dodgers on. So go check that out for sure. I always appreciate you guys supporting those guests that come on the show because I'm a big fan of those people. I'm good friends with those people, and I want you guys to be as well because we're all family, right? So go do that, please. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to mention No Halftime, which is a daily fantasy sports app where you get to play